Rise up!
This is the Rise Up See Red podcast, all about the Arizona Cardinals and the NFL, featuring insider and outsider perspectives. Enjoy the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Now here are your hosts, Jess Root and Seth Cox.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans, and welcome to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast. This is episode 309, and we've hit the official end of the offseason program. I'm your host, Jess Root from cardswire.com. My co-host is Seth Cox from revengeofthebirds.com, the Arizona Cardinals site from SB Nation, and also one of the hosts of the original Draft Breakdown podcast. Seth, minicamp is done. The Cardinals have wrapped things up for the offseason. Nothing Cardinals-wise in terms of activities until training camp at the end of July, which, by all reports, fans should be able to attend this year, although they can't come anywhere near the players apparently. But football is coming back. Fans are going to be back. This is exciting times.
Yeah, it's exciting, and it's getting just talking about it. I mean, we're getting to the point where nothing in the world of the Arizona Cardinals is happening. But for the first time in literally a decade, that's okay because you have the Phoenix Suns to actually be excited about. So it's an interesting time because, typically this time of the year, it's still football heavy in Arizona the last decade. So it's nice to not have to be the center of attention, right? For at least 5 weeks while the Suns do something entertaining in the playoffs. And obviously everybody's still kind of waiting to hear about Larry Fitzgerald. But outside of that, I mean, you're scraping the bottom of the barrel talking about Kyler Murray's being a three-sport athlete. And I mean, there's just, we're ranting on Budda Baker not getting the credit he deserves. And it's finally nice that
lists and rankings. That's what we see on the sites. Lists and rankings.
But it's nice that it's not necessary for the sports fan in the Valley for the first time in a decade for us to be producing a copious amount of content because they've actually got something else interesting to go on. But there's still plenty to talk about the Arizona Cardinals because let's face it, they've created, not the Cardinals, but the NFL have created a 12-month-a-year, show.
Absolutely. And by no means does that mean stop reading our stuff or stop listening to the podcast because that's not good. And so in this show, we're going to talk a little bit. Actually, Seth bringing up Larry Fitzgerald. We're going to talk about him a little bit. We're going to get our takeaways from minicamp. We're going to come up with we're going to talk about Budda Baker, COVID, vaccinations, and some league protocols that we're running across. And then, speculate as to a couple of players that have been on fans' radars for the Cardinals, whether they should acquire them or not. So let's get started. Talk about Larry Fitzgerald first. And this is recently, over the last few days, Patrick Peterson on his All Things Covered podcast with Bryant McFadden, former Cardinal as well, talked about Larry Fitzgerald as to what they think is going to happen. And Patrick Peterson said something kind of interesting. He says, if he ain't retired yet, if he ain't said he's retiring, he ain't retiring, which is very interesting. I mean, we've always felt that the lack of an announcement was more of just him waiting for the right time and that he'll eventually do it because if he intended on playing, he'd play. That's kind of an interesting take on that. And Patrick also says that there's really only two scenarios. The most likely scenario is he comes back to the Cardinals, or a second smaller chance that he joins the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Would you read into the scenario with Fitzgerald as the fact that he hasn't said he's going to retire, that he's leaning towards not retiring?
I think that's what it is at this point. I don't think that there's really anything else to read into it with because, I mean, he's a lot like Tim Duncan in regards of personality. Um, he's never cared for the spotlight. He loves his place in history, so I don't want anybody to think that he doesn't. But he's never been one that has needed to be the guy in the spotlight and be the guy that is um, everybody's looking at. And so him quietly retiring or not making a big production out of it, a la Tim Duncan last year, would have been probably the right thing. But it's starting, and again, I'm not saying this is who he's being like or anything negative, but it's starting to be a little Brett Favre-ish, right? Because so instead of it being the classic, even keeled Larry Fitzgerald, it's the kind of drama seeking, creating of narrative Brett Favre that we saw in his latter years, where he kind of held hostage the Green Bay Packers for a couple seasons, and then even
and then the Packers said, "We're done."
Yeah, and so I'm not saying I don't think that's where the Cardinals and Fitz are at this point, but it's the longer it drags on without any type of clarity, I think the harder it is to see him retire. It feels like he would want to be, know what his plans are heading into the season. And I guess that goes for either direction. And so that's why it's so difficult to see that he's just not done anything right now.
I mean, that's possible. Here's the one thing. I felt for months that the fact he hasn't announced his return means he's going to retire. However, we know he doesn't love the offseason, especially this offseason where the NFLPA leadership was saying don't go to anything in person, boycott it. We know he does not love training camp. He knows it's a necessary part. And so one scenario is this, and this is the only scenario I see, is that he is leaving things open for a return at the beginning or during the season. And some think that might cheapen things. But if he sees a team in need, or the Cardinals in need of a player, say there's an injury, something like that, that he could, almost kind of what Domata Peko and Jared Valdir have done the last couple of years, although stars you generally don't see do that, is maybe hop onto a playoff run to try and get that championship, because it really is the only thing he needs left on his resume. But at the same time, the other thing I think is simply he's busy with his stake in the Suns. Why interrupt the Suns news while it's happening? So now, as to would they have room for him? I mean, that would be interesting. They'd have to find a place for him to play, because they've moved on. They don't need him, but they'll find a place for him. And Pat said in something interesting, he probably, even after last season, he could give you, he wouldn't have to be or wouldn't expect to be a full-time player, that 20 to 35 good plays you could get. And I can see that in a reduced role. I don't know how much he would love a reduced role. And through the back channels of reports that aren't reportable things, there has been some chatter, whispers that he's not super happy with the organization. That's not to say he holds any spite towards them, but to announce the retirement and have to then put on a happy face with the organization it's just kind of his way of saying, no, I'm going to wait on this until I'm ready.
Yeah, and I think, we've talked about it before, and you just hit it on the head. Like, a lot of it just becomes that he doesn't want to do the off season anymore. And there is a grind to it. And there becomes a time when, as even an 18-year veteran in the NFL, you don't necessarily want to put forth the effort, or you know your body well enough to know, hey, I can gear up in July and August and be in the same spot as I would if I would start in May and June. So, I think for Fitz, it's just one of those situations where you just kind of allow him to continue to work through whatever the process is he's going through. Like you said, as a part owner of the Suns, as a potential 18-year veteran, and a guy that realizes that his number is not going to be called as much. It just may be, the combination of those things getting to the fact that he's going to wait until it's time.
Coming up next on the Rise Up Syria podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Let's talk about training camp or minicamp. What can we take away from the Cardinals' mandatory minicamp? The little bit that we can take away from it. That's coming up next on Rise Up C-Red. We're back on the Rise Up C-Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. And the Cardinals wrapped up their mandatory minicamp, a shortened offseason for them. Instead of having 10 OTAs and 3 minicamp practices, they condensed that down to 3 OTAs and 3 minicamps, and they didn't have any 7-on-7, 11-on-11. It was light drills and work. Just a little bit of work to get some evaluation of things and going on in that fashion. Therefore, there wasn't much to see, and the Cardinals do not open the entirety of their practice to reporting. And so therefore, there were things I saw that I can't necessarily report on. Though I will say this, there wasn't anything to note in terms of Cardinals versus Cardinals, players standing out, plays made in coverage, good throws, bad throws. There wasn't any of that to even report or hint at beyond that. For you, Seth, what were the main takeaways that you got out of the stories that came out of minicamp between what we heard from media members, what we heard from the interviews after the fact, that whether people were able to be part of or listen to after the fact?
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to this was a quick introduction for the new guys to the schemes and I guess the playbook itself. But for the most part, this was to get guys in shape, or just to see where guys, I shouldn't say get them in shape, but see where guys are as they are working this offseason, and make sure that the team is kind of all on the same page and focused. Like you said, there's not a lot of clarity, or there wasn't that much in how they're going to deploy positions at question. There wasn't a whole lot of information to glean. And it was clear that they were having a more of a look of like, hey, if you know the playbook, like step to the front of the line, we'll get things, you'll be the demonstrator of things, as opposed to, hey, new guys, you're running with the ones, type of stuff. So with all of that, I just think that you can't take a ton away from this outside of, obviously, they had better luck than some teams when it comes to health.
No injuries. Well, no major. The only one real injury I even heard of was Darqueze Dennard at the end of camp, who signed right at the end of camp, and he has a minor ankle injury. Max Williams is healthy, fantastic. Dennis Gardeck is recovering, but there wasn't, from other than the talks that we had of last week with the holdouts of Chandler Jones and Jordan Hicks, there is nothing to be concerned about in terms of injuries, which is good, because this is the time of year, and maybe we're going to see a trend in that direction. The offseason program is important, but maybe the grind of actual practices or light contact, non/non-contact practices, maybe is becoming a thing of the past, and it will be a thing that helps them get through the offseason healthier. That said, I do want to point out, just from observations, this is not, but there are a few players that I have my eyes on based on things I saw, whether they, for one reason or another. So one player that I'm going to keep an eye on, and I think everyone will, would be cornerback Robert Alford, coming back from the 2 years of injuries. Interested to see his deployment in training camp in the preseason. Michael Dogby, third-year defensive lineman, is a player of intrigue to me from what things that I saw. Rashard Lawrence as well, second-year defensive lineman. And then basically the right guard position. There wasn't much to watch in terms of drills, but I know that will be a position of intrigue. But based on, I was at practice a couple of days, and so from what things that caught my eye, those are some players to pay attention to once we hit training camp and those practices are open. Obviously, the story of Kyler Murray talking about baseball was a story that made the rounds. Not that I think that he's going to leave football to play baseball, but he still wants to play baseball. And I think there's a part of it that's not thrilled about the fact that he can't, based on this contract. J.J. Watt's presence is ever present. His influence on the team is palpable, what he's doing in the building. And so those are my main takeaways from minicamp, other than the fact that, hey, we don't know what's happening with Chandler Jones and Jordan Hicks. They are healthy, and there are some players that I'm going to have the back of my mind as we enter training camp.
Yeah, and there's just, there's interesting things to watch at specific positions, like you said, the corner, the right guard. I mean, positions we knew coming in, but I'm also interested in, as you said, the defensive line rotation, because it really seems like the Cardinals have more linebacker talent than they do defensive line talent. So, and what I mean by that is you've got a guy like Marcus Golden, you've got a guy like Devin Kennard, who aren't going to play on the interior, so who are you going to play? Is it going to be Watt and Jordan? How do you, where does Zach Allen fit in? How are you going to deploy all these guys? Or, are you going to be able to rotate in some of these young guys at the nose guard position as they try to, get healthy and stay healthy this year, something they struggled to do last year.
Coming up next on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Let's move on from minicamp and talk a little bit of some of the things that were coming up because of vaccines, Buda Baker, and more. That's coming up next on Rise Up See Red. We're back on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. We did have some bad news on two athlete fronts. One, completely unrelated to football, is Chris Paul, the heir of the Phoenix Suns, is in the health and safety protocols with a reported positive COVID test. But he wasn't the only athlete. As Buda Baker on his stories on Instagram today, on Wednesdays, we're recording on Wednesday evening instead of a Tuesday, revealed that he has COVID. However, which leads to wonder, because there also was the story from the Washington Post that said that the Cardinals are one of the teams that have lagged in player vaccinations, which is an interesting story because of, especially as Wednesday afternoon, the league and NFLPA agreed to new COVID protocols in which vaccinated players pretty much can lead a regular life. Unvaccinated players are pretty much stuck in the same protocols as last year. And I find it interesting that supposedly that the Cardinals players are slow to get the vaccine, which is an interesting choice to make in this day and age. Now, one thing we know about the new protocols is that training camps will be open to the public. However, players can't come and go from the building where non-Tier 1, Tier 2 employees come and go. They can't enter and leave where fans could be. And fans can't come within 20 feet of any players, so that means no autographs, no photos in terms of training camp, which does change the training camp experience for many, but it does get us closer to what we would consider normal. Now, on Buda Baker, nothing I'm going to publish in anything written. I have heard he is fully vaccinated, so he got COVID and got sick with the vaccination, which can happen, but that it's mild and he should be fine. But nonetheless, the question comes up considering now the report that the Cardinals are slow to get vaccinations on their team, supposedly. Do you see that a problem as the season approaches?
I mean, honestly, as long as he responds and is healthy, I think this is probably the best thing for Buda, because then we probably don't have to worry about him getting it during the season at all.
Potentially, yeah.
And you look at it you got to pull the silver linings out of everything. And like I said, as long as Buda's healthy, it's not a big deal at this juncture. Hopefully he doesn't have one of those nagging kind of cases that hangs around for a month or so. That would be awful.
Yeah.
You'd hate to have him just miss any time this year, because that's the thing is, like, there's going to be issues for a lot of teams, and whether it's injury, COVID, whatever. You just like to see the Cardinals get dealt a clean or cleanish hand this season. And it's something that they haven't had really in the last, I would say, 6 seasons. I mean, they've had a big injury or a major injury at bad spots too, or bad times. Almost every year. I guess the one you wouldn't say is the Steve Wilkes year, but that was just because they were so bad, so it didn't really matter. But I mean, you look at it, like Kyler's injury was at kind of at the worst point in time last year. It's just, you would like them to have that. And so if it's right now that we're talking about it, I think that's a good thing. Let's just hope that it clears itself up.
For me, the interesting thing of the story, at least with the team vaccinations, I'm not worried about Boot at all based on what I've heard. But the interesting thing, and I think this will blow over once training camp comes around, and when the non-vaccinated players see how different life is for the vaccinated players, I think things will change. Now, and I understand that the choice to get the vaccine is personal, and there is a lot of discussion, and this is nationwide, worldwide, and it's become kind of a political, hot topic as well. But my main concern for this is that you have players that they're worried about the long-term effects of the vaccine in their body who happen to play football, which we know absolutely, undoubtedly is terrible for your body long-term. And we don't know anything about COVID or about the vaccine, but we do know that playing football is bad for your body. So I find that highly ironic that, especially with the players, and maybe, who knows, maybe it's the players who are unlikely to make the team that are more dragging their feet in terms of requirements, though at the same time, I think they'd be the ones to jump all over, complying with things like that so that they are in a better place. I don't know. It's just, I find it puzzling, and I get why these are high performance athletes who think about their body. Their body is their livelihood, who would be reluctant to put another substance in their body that they don't know exactly what it's going to do. That said, they play football, and we know that's bad for their body.
Yeah, and so that's the thing is, you just don't want it to be a cultural thing within the Cardinals that they're not the team that gets the shots. But like I tell everybody, it's your own choice. It's not one we can make for you.
Nope.
And
But the league will make it very uncomfortable for you to not get it.
right. So that's the one thing you have to kind of watch as things happen.
Now, coming on next on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. Let's talk about a player long connected to the Cardinals this offseason, and that would be tight end Zach Ertz. Is it time for them to make that move? That's coming next on Rise Up See Red. We're back on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Zach Ertz is apparently still not happy with the situation in Philadelphia. The Cardinals still haven't really done anything about the tight end position. And Cliff Kingsbury said that that was going to be a position that they evaluate between, with see who's out there and available. Steve Kime mentioned free agent additions at tight end. Maybe he was referring to undrafted free agents, so they did bring in a couple. And they have brought in a player in Ross Travis, who has some experience in the league. But when you look at, I still find it hard to believe that when they say that they're going to evaluate and see who's out there, that's going to include the names Ross Travis and Jake Butt, whom they brought in for a workout. And it wouldn't include other names or more prominent names, especially when you have a guy like Ertz, whose talent far exceeds that of anyone on the roster, except for Max Williams, who is finally healthy. And that's one of the big things out of camp, is that Max Williams is healthy. He dealt with an ankle injury literally from before training camp all the way to the end of the season. He was never right with that ankle, and it looks like he is now. Now, is there a plus? Are there pros and cons to acquiring Ertz?
Yeah, I mean, the pro is obviously he's still a talented player. The con is that it's going to cost you a draft pick. I would imagine it is more than what anybody's expecting, since they haven't traded him yet. And that's the thing, is when you have a player, and so say Zach Ertz, and you're not interested in trading him unless you get what you want, then you have no reason to trade him. Even if he's disgruntled or whatever, you really have no reason to give in to his demands or desires for a trade. So that's, I think, the biggest con, is that how much are you willing to give up for a 31-year-old tight end? I think that's honestly the biggest question that you have to ask and have to be able to answer, is, what cost, and what is the cost you're willing to pay?
Well, and it's not only the draft capital, it's the fact, part of the issue that he has in Philadelphia is his contract. So you trade for him, that doesn't solve the contract issue, which means you're in a scenario like with Julio Jones, like with DeAndre Hopkins, and that's the thing. Maybe what teams aren't balking at is the draft capital, is the expectation of a new deal, because you've got a soon-to-be 31-year-old tight end who had his worst statistical year this last season, who has a history of missing games, although not significant. So he missed 5 games last year, but before that it was 15, all 16, 14, 14. So there's some durability there, but at the same time, his production at age 30 dropped. And so, as we've talked about in other shows, when it comes to trading for productive players, you're either going to give up significant draft capital for somebody who already has a good contract and they're fine with, but if they're going to have to be paid, then you generally don't see, most of the time, the draft capital that is given up. Now, we've seen exceptions to this in terms of the Rams and Jalen Ramsey, who gave up a fortune to get him, the Seahawks and Jamal Adams. But then you see, like, the Cardinals get DeAndre Hopkins. You have the Titans giving up a second-round pick for Julio Jones, both of whom were players that expected more money on their deal. You trade for Ertz, you're going to have to pay him. And maybe that is where is the holdup, is that you don't want to commit big money or even moderately big money to a 31-year-old tight end who had his worst year a year ago.
And I mean, the other thing is when you look at the position, I think there's this misunderstanding of how you have to go after each position. And, you know, we talked about this a little bit. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers have made it difficult, but the reality is you can't have a star at every position. And when you look at the Cardinals, sometimes there are positions that you choose to, I don't want to say ignore, but you choose to go on the cheaper side. And if you are the Cardinals this year, you're going there with running back and tight end, having spent a lot of money, obviously, along the offensive line and at wide receiver. So, I mean, you have a limited supply of capital, and so how you deploy that capital is what ends up being what matters. And I think just it's one of those situations where you just look at it and expect the Cardinals to upgrade because the names aren't any good. But I mean, the Packers offense was fantastic with Robert Tonyan and Mercedes Lewis. I mean, come on, and I'm not comparing them, but when you do a nice job and when you develop players, you should be able to get away without having to give up capital, whether it be draft or salary capital at every single position.
Well, and then there's like you invest a lot in tight end for the Cardinals, you're going to get minimal returns. Like people thought Dan Arnold was going to have a ginormous season a year ago. We tried to be the voice of reason on this podcast and say if he has there really isn't room in the offense for him to have more than 35 catches. And if he has 30 to 35 catches and about 6 touchdowns, you're super happy with that. And what did Dan Arnold end up with? He ended up with 31 catches and 4 touchdowns, which is, you really couldn't expect more than that. He could have been more consistent, but you go out and get a player of Ertz caliber. Is he going to be significantly more productive than Max Williams when unless you get a true pass catching tight end, and Ertz can do that because he's been wildly productive before. Are you going to get more than 30 catches from Ertz in this offense? Like, I wouldn't expect Max Williams to be more than 20 catches, even if he has a completely healthy season. So if you're going to go invest multiple years at pretty decent money, because Max Williams, they invested, what was it, $3.5 million a year? That's fine for what you're going to get out of him in terms of importance to the offense and production in the passing game. You're probably not getting your return on investment by getting Ertz, as appealing as that sounds.
Yeah, and that's been my thing the whole time. I just don't know if you're going to get anything from it.
Coming up next on the Rise Up C-Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web, we will wrap up talking about yet another player who is currently having his own contract squabble, and that would be cornerback Stephon Gilmore. That's coming up next on Rise Up C-Red. We're back on the Rise Up C-Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. And the Cardinals appear to have filled their cornerback room with adequate players. So they signed Malcolm Butler. They bring back Byron Murphy, whom they are expecting to be pretty good this year. They brought back Robert Alford. They signed Darqueze Dennard, and then they drafted Marco Wilson and Tay Gowan. And so they have themselves a room that you're pretty comfortable with. And considering the production they got in pass defense a year ago, they were pretty solid as a pass defense. And they got from a subpar Patrick Peterson and Dre Kirkpatrick. You could probably you look at the cornerback room this year, you can say I think they are not worse off than they were before, even though they lost Patrick and Dre. I don't think they're in a worse position. Arguably, you might be a little bit better in terms of floor. Patrick's bad games were bad. Dre made some bad plays. Your best games from Patrick aren't probably going to be the same caliber as the best games from Butler. But I think you've raised the floor of their cornerback play, and based on what you got defensively, I think that's about what you can expect. However, Stephon Gilmore, 4-time Pro Bowl, 2-time All-Pro, 2019 Defensive Player of the Year, is holding out with the Patriots because he enters in the final year of his contract. He is going to be 31 years old this year, and when he's a couple of months away, so he will be in his age 31 season, and he's due to make about $7 million. I'm sure he's looking for, well, one, more security and more money. I read one place where he's probably looking at the Darius Slay contract and thinking that's probably what he deserves, especially since he still shows up on top cornerback lists. And even though he did not play as well last year, he was still a Pro Bowler. He played in 11 games. He only had 1 interception and only broke up 3 passes as opposed to the 6 picks and 20 pass breakups that he had in 2019. Gilmore might be available. At some point, the Cardinals inquired, but there haven't been any true reports of any of this, of any team going after him. The question is, should the Cardinals make a move for Gilmore?
It's a twofold thing. One, they need the veteran kind of potential longevity that Gilmore gives. I know he's going to be 31, but he's the type of player that looks like he could play for 4 more seasons at a high level, and so I think that's important. But 2, the reality is one of the teams that's heavily invested in looking at him is the Seattle Seahawks. And so you have to, as the Cardinals, pursue every angle, similar to the Julio Jones trade, where, hey, if your NFC West rivals are exploring, bringing in a potential All-Pro, you have to go explore it as well. You have to look for it and see if the fit and the cost is right. For those reasons, I think you have to. Obviously, the old adage, you can never have enough cornerbacks. Cardinals fans have seen that for the last...
when they were starting Tremaine Brock and Byron Murphy in 2019, that was the best.
So I just think that obviously he would be your cornerback 1. It gives you some flexibility with Byron Murphy. I know there's a lot of high expectations for Murph, and I think he can play up to them. But I think the fact that they still allegedly want to see him slide inside when they go into nickel makes it so that you would prefer not to have him having to play boundary and then inside on nickel, and instead you go, hey, we can get a true great boundary corner and let him play in Stephon Gilmore. Obviously, it's a cost thing, but I think for Gilmore, he's a more palatable, if you're giving up a 2nd or a 3rd round pick, and you probably get away with a 3rd round pick because it's the Patriots and they understand how comp picks work. I think that's what you're going to get.
Right. And I think if you could pull it off, it'd be fantastic, because I think, well, one, DeAndre Hopkins is out there on social media doing his work. Call him the best cornerback in the league. That I think adding Gilmore to this defense could make them like, I think this defense as constructed should be an above average, bordering top 10 defense if everything works out. You add Stephon Gilmore to that mix, a healthy Stephon Gilmore, and I think that team could be a solid top 10, maybe top 5 defense, making, I think this Cardinals team could and should have a top 5 scoring and a top 5 scoring offense this year, everything working out the way it should. And if they do that with the defense, I think it would put them very much in contention in the NFC. The problem is, of course, what do you give up for it? And then what money are you committing to him for the next 2-3 years? Because you're not just trading for Stephon Gilmore, you're trading for him and paying him. And they weren't willing to pay Patrick Peterson. They signed Malcolm Butler to a rather modest deal, and Gilmore is of the same age as those two players, right in the same part of his career, although he has played at a much higher level. He is coming off the injury, but that's the thing. As you brought up, if the Seahawks are involved, then at minimum, what you gotta do is to get involved to at least drive up the price. That's you have to do that. You have an obligation to do that, to make a couple of phone calls, say what it's going to take. Now, the Cardinals have benefited from the trading of a second-round pick before. They've done it a few times, including with the Patriots, to get Chandler Jones. Although, I will say, this is different because of the age. And if they're truly, then this is a Cardinals team that feels like they're going all in. This is the type of move you make. You've gone and got J.J. Watt. You went and got A.J. Green. You went and traded for Rodney Hudson. And if there is one area on your defense that there's a little bit of question mark at, especially when you've got those young linebackers in the middle, why not shore up the boundaries and get one of the best and commit to him for a couple, 3 years and pay him what he wants to get paid and turn your defense into a real juggernaut, putting you arguably with the continuity that you potentially could compete with the Rams in this division.
Yeah, and that's the thing is you look at the defenses in this division and then you look at the offenses, and we talked about it. I'm not sure where the Cardinals rank as in terms of offense in this division. Are they going to be able to keep up? I mean, you're talking about for half the season the best offense in the NFL in Seattle. A Super Bowl offense when healthy in San Francisco, and then an offense that's been a top 10 offense under Sean McVay is expected to take a step up with Matt Stafford at the helm. So are they going to have a top 5 offense? Because you probably need a top 5 offense to compete in this division. If you're going to have a top 12 defense. However, if you have a top 5 defense, then you're probably going to be able to compete consistently week in, week out, and potentially put yourself in a position to be competing late in the season. Does Gilmore get them over the top? I think that's the question you have to ask yourself, and that's a hard question.
And I think he can. I think that's kind of the one ingredient that they don't have on their defense. They've got the athleticism. They've got the all-pro at the back end. They've got the athleticism at linebacker. They've got the edge rushers on the edge and the interior when you've got J.J. Watt and Justin Phillips as well. What you don't have is somebody to lock them down on the outside. Butler can do it sometimes. Byron Murphy might develop into that, but Gilmore, can do it. And so I think based on what we've seen, if there's one ingredient they don't have, he's the guy.
Yeah, and so that's the thing. So if you think that puts you in, and I know people are going to kind of laugh and scoff at this, but you have to look at this from a two-prong approach. One, like I said, within the NFC West, but you have to look at it and say, does this allow you? How does this match you up with Tampa Bay? Because that's the thing is like if you are truly a team that aspires to compete and win the NFC West, that automatically vaults you into a top 2 or 3 team in the NFC, which means that you have to look at how you're going to compete against teams like Tampa Bay, Green Bay, if they retain Aaron Rodgers. And so for that reason, you have to look at Tampa Bay and say, what do we need to beat Tampa Bay? And I think if you gave me an option, I think every 9 times out of 10, I would say 10 times out of 10, I'm going to take Stephon Gilmore, unless the price for Zach Ertz is just that substantially lower, where you're talking, maybe a 6th-round pick and
then do both. Then do
right.
both.
Yeah, exactly. Give up a 2 and a 6 and get both.
Yeah, well, because for me, Zach Ertz, I don't think he does anything significant to improve the team overall, while Stephon Gilmore, I think he is the ingredient you're missing on defense. Now, I think the defense will be solid this year, but adding Gilmore is top notch, and that's kind of what I'm looking at, and I love the idea of that. I don't think they will, because for the same reason they didn't pay Patrick Peterson more, the same reason they didn't go after William Jackson, who is younger and just as talented, or going after Steven Nelson, is I think they're content with what they have right now. And I think it also is a tribute to what they believe that Byron Murphy can be as well.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is like, you still have to look at this from a long-term approach too, and whether that long term approach is just 3 seasons, because the NFL, I mean, there's no such thing as long term, but if it's 3 seasons, Gilmore gives you 3 seasons, whereas Malcolm Butler has been on such a decline. Like, you're comfortable with him in a 1-year scenario where maybe you extend him for a 2nd season, right? But you're not in this, like, there are 2 different approaches. So I think, I'm with you. I think if you can get him at the right price, and like I said, I think they would do a 3rd. You get him for a 3. You'd probably have to give up something else too, but like, you get him for a 3, and then you sign him to a 3-year, $42 million contract. I think that's a huge win for you as the Cardinals, and gives you, again, that kind of cornerback 1, cornerback 2 for the next 2 seasons, 3 seasons, while you expect Byron Murphy to continue to take the next step.
Absolutely. And with that, let us wrap up this edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. We will take a week break. We'll be back again in 2 weeks, where we will start with, that will be our yearly division ranking show, where we'll go across the NFC West, kind of rank positions and players. And then we will get into the month of July, in which I've already started recording. We will do our our opponent previews. I'm beginning to interview the site editors for the wire sites for the Cardinals opponents this year, and that will take us to training camp at the end of July. So we're off next week. We'll be back in 2, and then we should have shows running from there until we start minicamp and then the preseason. That's Seth Cox. I'm Jess Root. This is the Rise Up See Red podcast. Thanks for listening, as always.
Thanks for listening to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast. Listen to previous episodes and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Audioboom, or many other podcast platforms, so shows are delivered directly to your mobile device. Please give the show a 5-star rating and always support the sponsors who support the show. We'll be back soon for the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Rise up, Red Sea, be Red, See Red, and of course, Rise Up, See Red.
Run!